My friends, you might remember me telling you at the beginning of this unit that I thought this was the most vital, most interesting unit to teach. I actually really look forward to it every year. And ah, malaria, man, I've got absolutely hit. Just in the hospital for 3 days. As I think folks know, I'm going to be at least a couple more days before I'm back. And just looking at where we are in the semester, I'm going to have to actually miss out on a lot of the stuff that I think makes this so engrossing, but want to make sure that we're at least kind of keeping up with stuff. So, what I'm going to do, you'll be watching this in class today. You're not going to watch the whole thing. I'm going to actually just ask you to watch it separately, individually, and you want to work with somebody, that is fine. There will be a note sheet that you can work on. Um, it's going to be due, but it's not necessarily tomorrow because I think this will go on. It might go on an hour and a half because I'm combining basically three class periods kind of into one of these because I'm not sure how long I'll be out. So it's not per se due, but I will take a look tomorrow. I expect people to be working on this. And if I look at something and just say, a ninth grader, bright person in a college prep class, and I don't really see any work being done here. That would affect the final grade for sure, because I do expect you to be working on it. So, reminder about how to take these notes. You'll see the template. They'll give you the main ideas on the left. You add your own details. You do not want to just simply type what somebody else is typing. Even if you're working with somebody, you can discuss it, but you need to put these in your own words. These are notes you're taking. Complete sentences mean absolutely nothing. It is a waste of your time. Yes, you could type every single word on every single slide, and that would just take you forever. And it wouldn't really be that useful for you either because you're not thinking about it. So, again, good bullet pointed abbreviation. Here's the thing I always say with these. If you were to pick this up in a month and look at it the first time, could you look through these notes and say, you know what? I've got a pretty good recording here of the World War One, 1914 to 1918. This makes sense to me. I might still have more questions, things that I missed, but yes, this makes sense to me. So, with no further ado, and I will see how long I can go without coughing because the malaria spread to upper respiratory. Ah, it's just a mess, just a mess. I got to tell you, people always talk about how much fun malaria is, how everybody loves getting malaria, and it's just not for me. Just not for me. Okay. All right. Silliness aside, let's get going. So I'm taking this kind of year by year. I'm going to go very quickly through the first year because we really had already covered that, but just give it a running start, etc. Remember, the Archduke is assassinated on June 28th, 1914. Europe spent a month trying to frantically get out of war, and it just didn't happen. I believe it was August 3rd. Well, yeah, you see it there. Germany invaded Belgium. Belgium was just, what did we do? You're on the way to France. The French were prepared for an attack. I'll show you a map in just a second, but they were prepared for attack directly across from the border from Germany, and Germany just said, no, we want to win this thing. The Germans' plan, and we'll spend more time with this, the Schlieffen Plan. Remember the one major disadvantage of the Germans. They're fighting a two-front war. They've got to take on the French and the British and the Russians. They believe that they can quickly march into France, capture Paris, might take a few months. The British will negotiate a truce, and then they can turn toward Russia. And you know what? They're fairly successful for a while. We'll see this in the map in a second that you've already seen. The Russians are getting pulverized, people killed by the hundreds of thousands. I believe 1 million dead altogether in 1914, just those last 5 months of it. The Ottoman Empire, which had a treaty with Germany. Why? Because they were intimidated by the Russians and thought that they might choose the right side and save their empire. They did not. Yeah, you can see the obvious place where the Germans are, where the French are expecting the Germans, right along here. Then they've got all their soldiers down here. Well, the Germans pull a fast one and just go through Belgium. And again, they come very close. If we're talking starting on August the 3rd, hey, this is September the 5th here, and they're already at this yellow line. You see where Paris is. And remember, the Germans had done exactly this in 1870, 1871. Took a couple of months and, had captured Paris. So they thought this was quite possible. But by this point, the British soldiers are mobilized. They come in, and you're going to see those sort of green and yellow dotted lines. This is where it is by Christmas. Remember, the Christmas truce happens all along that area, and that line barely moves for the next 4 years. Yeah, let's say 3 years, because in that last year, starting in 1918, it starts to move very quickly. Again, know the map. Yep. Central powers in the middle. If you want to include Bulgaria in that, you're quite welcome to. But it's really the big three on each side at this point. I mean, Italy, which had a treaty with Germany, did join the Allied powers. Portugal does not, as far as I know, play a terribly major role. Good to know this. The key thing on this, though, German army might is second to none, and it is powerful. But the British Navy, all it needs to do is successfully blockade that area called the North Sea, where you see the words North Sea. And if they can do this, it means the Germans are not going to be able to get food or supplies in. The German Navy is big, it's powerful, it's growing. It cannot blockade all the Allies. In a nutshell, that's the results of World War One. So again, the strategies, the Schlieffen Plan, we have mentioned this. Schlieffen, just a German general name. It's an attempt to control the land. That's Germany's strength. And they were connected, so they had kind of like they could coordinate a lot better. The Allied powers, it was all about British naval power. That was going to be the key to the victory, they decided, and they were quite right about that. Again, little access to the coastline for the Central Powers and the blockades. We'll get more into them later. We've seen this. Dreadnoughts are battleships. Of course, they have thousands and thousands of smaller ones, but these are major, powerful things. The numbers, in case you didn't pick this up the other day, the first number is number at the beginning of the war, and then how many more were built during the war. And you just see the British with all of its allies, especially once the United States comes in with a massive naval advantage. Yeah, photograph, photograph. We're almost getting to new stuff here. Again, size of the armies still not well formatted. I need to change this one of these years, but I get lazy. Yeah, you see there are an awful, awful, awful lot of Russians, of course, very, very, very poorly armed and equipped. Lots of German soldiers. Germany lose, I think, 1 out of 5 or close to that young men in the military don't survive that war. This is the German key to trying to survive this war, and these, of course, are Unterseebooten, or submarines. Untersee. Yeah, yeah, it's logical, in it? So they're able to fire depth charges, and one thing that's frightening, if you are British soldiers or sailors or even just a merchant ship, you're not involved in the military, you're a cruise ship, you don't know where these things are. And the Germans plan to try to cause enough damage, enough disruption that basically the Brits won't have an advantage either, the British and the French. So again, the idea is to break the blockade, break down, destroy enough ships, not only the German, I think the dreadnoughts themselves, the massive blockade ships, I don't think with the technology at that point they were very susceptible. Could be wrong. Military history is not my main thing. But for sure, all the tons and tons and tons and tons and millions of tons of stuff coming across the Atlantic that is easily getting into Britain and France and Italy and Ireland and is not getting into Germany or Austria-Hungary. How do we stop that from coming through? So they use these submarines to attack. Now, the Lusitania, I think in one class we got to mention this, the other class we did not. The Lusitania, you see famous headline, one of the most famous from the New York Times. You can't quite see the date on this, but it's May of 1915. And if I told you the United States does not enter the war until April of 1917, does it sound likely that the sinking of the Lusitania was the immediate cause of U.S. entry? No, of course it doesn't. That's a 2 year gap. So there had to be something else going on. Now, I would say German submarine warfare is probably the major cause of this, but the Lusitania is just, it's famous, it's infamous, and it's kind of a picture of things yet to come. So Lusitania, it's a passenger ship. This is not a military ship. There are not soldiers. It is not armed, etc. It's coming from New York City to London, I believe, and is off the coast of Ireland. And it is torpedoed by the Germans. Kills a lot of civilians, 1,200. And I don't mention the Americans because, well, American life is more important. Of course not. But remember, the United States has stayed out of this war entirely. And if they were to come and join the war on the side of the Allies, and this could bring the United States into it, it would be probably disastrous for the Germans. So keep that thought in mind. One of the things the Germans claimed is that, well, yeah, there were civilians on that plane. We get it, but they're also weapons. And the fact that like it exploded with a torpedo and then erupted again and again and sank so quickly, to the best of my understanding, there is a definite consensus that absolutely American arms manufacturers and the British government were saying, hey, look, it's a passenger ship. No one's going to attack it. Who will know? Who will care if we slip a whole bunch of weapons into the bows of the ship? And of course, from the German perspective, and you don't say, oh, this is fine, 1,200 people died, that's fine. You don't say that. But what you can say is, what would those weapons have been used for if they've gotten through? And the answer is to kill a lot of Germans. So you can make an argument that the Germans might have been morally justified, or at least you could question this for a pretty brutal attack. Again, not, not, not the immediate cause of U.S. entry into World War I. And why do I keep emphasizing this? Because I almost guarantee you talk to somebody someday, it's like, hey, what brought the, just, testing them, what brought the United States into World War I? Oh, the sinking of the Lusitania. And that is just not true. Not true. Okay, once again, the same map. I'll keep coming back to this because you sort of see, well, really this hard situation the Germans are in. They do have some advantages, but there is so little seacoast that is open to them. So again, last look at this before we move on to 1914. There are a number of, by the way, very powerful video clips from the Great War and the shaping of the 20th century. I don't think I'm going to try to have the substitute show them when I'm gone, but maybe I'll give you some recommendations about certain parts of it. Try to bring this alive a little bit more. So by 1915, again, term you have to know, stalemate. In chess, it's impossible for either side to win. It's a draw. And that's what we have. If you go back again to that map and you see the quick German advance into France for a month and then being pushed back on both, well, especially on the Western Front, it just stays there. Nobody wins. Everybody loses. A couple things happen in April. One is that Italy joins with the Allies. Now, Italy had been in an alliance with Germany, so why would they join the other side? You remember that bop? I think I walked around and bopped you on the head. The balance of power, the idea that the Germans and particularly the Austrians had, a lot of power over and influence over land that Italy wanted. It was self-interest. Italy thought, we're on the right side of this war. We win. We're going to have access to land when that Austro-Hungarian, the Habsburg Empire breaks up. So it's selfish entirely. It's self-serving, but that's war. In May, the Lusitania happens. Again, the stalemate just continues. The line didn't move by the end of 1915. Again, cities in France that changed place 68 times. The Russians had lost 2 million men. I believe that's severely wounded to the point they were knocked out of the war in that year or dead. Russian casualties, I think they're even underestimated from what I've read, but they are just brutal. And I did mention, or I just saw that in the last screen, the Armenian genocide. And this is rough. A little bit of a trigger warning. There are some unpleasant images. There is a clip that I absolutely need to show you about the Armenian genocide. First of all, what is an Armenian? It is a Central European, almost say Eurasian. It's kind of like one of those Turkey type things, but I don't know if we would call that Central Asian, Southeastern European. It's sort of hard to say exactly where you'd call. Um, Armenians, remember that the Ottoman Empire was a very, very, very diverse empire. It had people from all religions, I mean, all types of nationalities, languages, etc. The thing about the Ottoman Empire, they were not cuddly. I mean, the caliph's mind, the sultan decided what happened. They could be as brutal as any warring empire. But the way that the Ottomans generally chose to control their empire was not to insist that everybody must become like us. They allowed people to keep their own religion. I will tell you that in the 14, 15, 1600s, if you were a, God help us, a Muslim living in any place in Western Europe, your life was on the line. Jews were horrifically persecuted, horrifically, and their places simply could not live. They've been driven out of France, they've been driven out of Spain. You were even the wrong type of Christian, and religious wars are being fought. And the Ottomans are honestly, they don't particularly care. Of course, Sunni Islam is the best, and this is our leader, but hey, as long as you folks are willing to, well, not willing to, you do pay your taxes, you do what we tell us to, you certainly don't challenge the authority of the Sultan, you certainly don't challenge the authority of Islam. Honestly, you can do pretty much what you want to do. That was one of the really noble things about the Ottoman Empire. However, as the Ottoman Empire started to fall apart, um, things happen when people feel threatened. When you a nice puppy dog gets its back against the wall, the fangs come out. And the Ottoman Empire, as they're trying to figure out what's going wrong and how they are falling from grace and power, many start to see it's these ethnic minorities within the Ottoman Empire. They're the problem, and in particularly Armenians. Armenians are, in many cases, they were called the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. They tended to have a much higher level of education. They tended to, they were good with money. They were good business people. They were fine for most Ottomans in the 1600s. It's a very successful, prosperous group of non-Muslim, non-Turks. Well, that's fine. They pay their taxes. They don't give us trouble. But then, especially even before the war, but especially when the war began, oh, this is what's happening. They are destroying us from inside. We heard this in a very recent presidential election, by the way. They are poisoning the blood of this country. They're the enemy within. It's scary to hear this kind of talk, and we are hearing it again. You see, there were horrifying massacres in the 1890s. I don't know a lot about them. Well, once the war started, the idea was these are not Ottoman citizens. They are a threat. We've got to make sure that we can trust them. So, trust them. We have to deal with them. So they started rounding them up, going into Armenian areas. They mostly lived kind of among themselves in small villages and parts of cities and just simply rounded people up by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, and pushed them into these relocation camps, concentration camps, call them what you wish to, and sometimes just wholesale, flat out murder, just, mass execution. Um, we have absolutely no idea how many Armenians died during this war. I've seen numbers as low as seven, 800,000. I've seen some double that. And I think we really don't know because there were no burials, there were no records. There were just simply whole villages exterminated in an afternoon. By the way, not only the Armenians, Greeks who had a long history within the Ottoman Empire. Excuse me, I'm squirmy and my body is so achy from this malaria. Also, the lights are dim because the bright light hurts me. So, hey, you should just be impressed that I'm actually doing this, right? Um, but yeah, hundreds of thousands of Greeks and other minorities, etc. Now, if if I were teaching right now in Turkey and this slide were on the screen, I would probably be in prison by later that afternoon. And you know what? My embassy would not get me out. The Turkish government since this time has been absolutely adamant. This did not happen. It did not happen. It's lies. It's propaganda. Are you saying no Armenians were harmed? Look, we can't control what every Ottoman soldier did. I mean, I'm sure there were some abuses that took place. Uh, It's wartime. Look, everybody suffered. Lots of people died. There was no targeted attempt to kill the Armenians, says the Turkish government, and that's just wrong. That is, it's not just something that was discovered, a century later, and here's what really happened. It was being broadcast and published in the New York Times, firsthand accounts, photographic evidence. One of the most, I mean, really most touching things is that it was a German officer named Armin Wegener. I think he was a medic who saw what his Turkish allies, because he was in the German army, saw what was happening and said, you know what, this is not okay. And at great risk to himself and his life, he brought out a big, heavy camera and filmed what he saw. Um, so it absolutely happened, and it was horrific. It was, uh, we could say maybe we can call the Congolese a genocide. Certainly, the blood body count was there without any question at all. Um, but at the same time, that doesn't make it better, but not an active attempt to exterminate a race. And that's what happened here. Again, going to show you a very difficult and moving clip about this when I get back. Um, yeah, again, not pretty images. None of these are. There are thousands of these photographs. It just people were starved to death. People were tortured to death. They were marched out into the desert without food or water. They were tied together with ropes and pushed off bridges, beheaded, you name it. It's something we're all trying to figure out. Most of us are pretty nice people most of the time. I mean, I look around and I've never been around anybody who would act like this. But one thing we know is that when people become frightened and end up in the wrong environment, we're capable of things like this. So, um, Armenian genocide today is something that Armenian populations are still quite adamant about having it recognized. The world community recognizes it. It's really Turkey. And, Turkey has long wanted to be a part of the EU. As far as I can tell, it's very unlikely that will ever happen until Turkey says, look, our people did something awful 100 years ago. We acknowledge it, but the Turkish government absolutely unwilling. And Turks who have spoken up, who have said, look, this is part of our historical legacy. It's not pretty, but it's real. They've been attacked, they've been harassed, in many cases assassinated, imprisoned. Yeah, it's pretty awful stuff. By 1916, the two battles that we're really going to be looking at, and this is really like the ultimate in stalemate, the Battle of Verdun, and the other is the Battle of the Somme. And you'll notice one of them lasts about 9, 10 months, and the other lasts 4 months. They occur concurrently. One is a German attack, Verdun. One is the British attack to finally break through, and both of them completely useless. Hundreds of thousands, millions die. Absolutely nothing changes. Tanks are here. We're moving toward mechanized war for sure. And you'll see that in World War II. So the Battle of Verdun, and you can see Verdun here. Again, it's along that line that hadn't changed in 2 years, right? You see that arrow. I don't understand the military implications behind it, but it is said that Verdun was strategically vital. It was up like on a hill of some sort. Um, if the Germans were able to push the French out and take over that land, they would at least have like a real advantage if they decimated the French army to be able to push on further into France, either win the war or at very least maybe negotiate a settlement favor to them. Because remember, that blockade is happening and it is killing the Germans. And the Germans know this. They know that they're running out of time. Um, the Germans were pretty blunt about this. This wasn't about getting land. Their intention was to bleed the French army white, just destroy as many human beings they could. Um, you know, in this time, 1 million casualties. Again, it doesn't mean like, oh, I hurt my finger. That means missing arm, just absolutely devastated. 500,000 dead. And, it was probably I don't know, from the school to Lasad, maybe do that in three directions. It's a tiny area that has tens of millions of soldiers just pouring at each other, and nobody can win. Um, back and forth, attack and a counterattack, and just nothing helps at all. So the British decide they need to do something. The British decide, first of all, if the French should fall at Verdun, and that seemed like a possibility for a while, that would be a huge trouble for the British. So what the British do is they launch what I think to that time was the largest offensive in military history. And the idea was we are going to take everything that we have and we are absolutely going to just attack the German lines. What they ultimately did was they spent a solid week taking every single cannon, explosive, mortar, bomb, you name it, and firing it 24 hours a day at the German lines, mostly in trenches, over and over and over again, day and night, 24 hours a day for a solid week. The noise was so loud it could be heard across the English Channel as far as Dover and even London. I mean, the ground was shaking across the English Channel. Um, the British then think, okay, we've done this for a week. The Germans going to have nothing there. I mean, they're just going to be wiped out. This is the big chance. We will launch the biggest invasion we've ever had, the biggest attack that we've had, and the Germans will simply fold and we will push on through France, get to the German border. They really felt this was going to happen. Well, turns out that the German soldiers, yeah, they suffered a lot of casualties, a lot of deaths in that week. But there were a lot more there, and they still had their machine guns. And on that very first day, 20,000 British soldiers alone died trying to run across that no man's land toward the German machine guns. And again, a million casualties, this time in 5 months. What did the Allies, what did the English get out of it? 12 kilometers at their deepest, but they get pushed back again. Absolutely useless, absolutely futile. Photographs from the Somme. Again, these cemeteries, every time I look at these, I just think any one of those crosses, boy, that was somebody just not different than us, had their dreams, had their hopes. Photography is so much more powerful here because people don't need to pose. The look on that man's face, holding probably his dead or dying brother on top of him, pretty nasty stuff. Historian Adam Hochschild, who, by the way, wrote one of the greatest books on King Leopold's Congo, but also wrote about World War One. When the artillery barrage reached its crescendo, 224,221 shells in the last 65 minutes alone, the rumble could be heard as far away as Hampstead Heath in London. More shells were fired by the British this week than they had been used in the entire first 12 months of the war, and some gunners bled from the ears of days of non-stop firing. At a forest near Gomcart, entire trees were tossed in the air by shelling, and the entire forest set itself on fire. So, the reality of that. This is after the war. Well, I can read it to you directly. Imperial strategist of the General Staff of Britain tried to explain the strategy. He said, remembering the dissatisfaction displayed by ministers at the end of 1915 because the operations had not come up to their expectations. In other words, the end of 1815, the members of parliament, the ministers, the war staff, the British government, look, we've got to do something. The general staff took the precaution to make quite clear beforehand the nature of the success which the Somme campaign might yield. The necessity of relieving pressure on the French army at Verdun remains and is more urgent than ever. This is therefore the first objective to be obtained. The second objective, however, is to inflict as heavy losses as possible on the German armies. So this was going to be the massive attack. This was going to be the one that was a breakthrough. And you might recall last week we saw in the beginning of one of the episodes of The Great War in Shaping the Civilization, the voice of the journalist who said, I traveled across Europe in the build up to war, and I saw people, shouting out and cheering and excited because this was going to be a wonderful thing. But it was only me. It was only me that knew what was going to come because I had seen war. Philip Gibbs was a fantastic journalist. I need to actually go back and read one of his full books, but this is one of his descriptions. And I just find the language here to be so powerful that I do read it to you in full. Now, one of the things I'm hoping is I'm looking at this, I see that my face is covering up that last paragraph, which is frustrating, but I can't move that around and I can't get rid of that. So I hope I will get that, but you can read the whole, be able to remember what is there. So, watching what was happening, preparing for the big offensive at the Somme in July 1916. In front of us was not a line, but a fortress position, 20 miles deep, entrenched and fortified, defended by masses of machine gun posts and thousands of guns in a wide arc. No chance for the cavalry. But on that night they were massed behind the infantry. Among them were the Indian cavalry, whose dark faces were illuminated now and then for a moment when someone struck a match to light a cigarette. Before dawn there was a great silence. We spoke to each other in whispers if we spoke. Then suddenly our guns opened out in a barrage of fire of colossal intensity. Never before, and I think never even since, not even in the Second World War, had so many guns been massed behind any battle front. It was a rolling thunder of shell fire, the earth vomited flame, and the sky was alight with bursting shells. It seemed as though nothing could live, not even an ant, under that stupendous artillery storm. But the Germans in their deep dugouts lived, and when our wave of men went over, they were met by deadly machine gun fire and mortar fire. Our men got nowhere on the first day. They'd been mown down like grass by German machine gunners, who, after our barrages lifted, rushed out to meet our men in the open. Many of the best battalions were almost entirely annihilated, and our casualties were terrible. A German doctor, taken prisoner near La Boisselle, stayed behind to look under our wounded in a trench instead of going down to safety. I saw him coming back across that next morning. One of our men was carrying his bag, and I had a talk with him. He was this tall, thick man with a black beard, and he spoke good English. This war, he said, it holds no purpose. It is a war against religion and against civilization, and I hate it. The Battle of the Somme. 1917 is where we start to see a change. The key development. Germany announces unrestricted submarine warfare. Now remember, the Germans had been using submarine warfare for 3 years, but were only supposed to be attacking enemy ships, and even that was considered uncivilized. But that's what they did. However, there was the question. It's not just the Lusitania. There were other passenger ships that were hit. It was kind of this cat and mouse game. The Germans would attack. Oops, they'd hit a passenger ship. The United States would threaten. The Germans would back off, back and forth. Well, in February, the Germans say any ship under any flag, military, civilian, it's fair game. And there's a reason why they did this. Sounds crazy because you know that'll pull the United States in the war, and it does. There was a reason behind it. March, the Tsar Nicholas II, the 300 years of the Romanov family, is overthrown. The Tsar is gone. In April, and Germany now could potentially have a one-front war. We'll see if that ends up being what happens. The United States, however, formally declares war in April of 1917. Poison gas begins to be used. And then, in November, there's a second Russian Revolution. This is the Bolshevik or Communist Revolution. We're probably going to be looking at this in a separate unit. I feel like it makes more sense, but important to know what happens. So Russia is not only now the first communist country, but it pulls out of the war, which means Germany has now got that one front war it thought it would have in 1914. But why is that not really an advantage for Germany? because the United States is coming completely armed with millions and millions of soldiers, well fed, well armed, to line up with the British and the French. So the blockade itself, now certainly people said torpedoing the Lusitania, that's a war crime, and I think it's pretty hard to argue that it wasn't. How about the blockade itself? The situation in Germany going into 1917 was one of growing chaos, disorganization, and sickness, all stemming from the blockade, and subsequently, Germany's inability to provide its people with adequate provisions to sustain normal, productive lives. While few individuals starved to death between 1914 and 1918, official British post-war statistics counted that 772,000 starved to death because of the blockade. Millions did succumb to malnutrition, which led to severe decreases in body mass and near constant suffering. And it goes on to say that by the end of the war, the average German civilian, lost between 15 and 20% of his body weight between 1914 and 1918. And of course, that means health. And understand there are no medicines coming through. The blockade completely cut off the Germans. The United States, by the way, objected strongly to this, did not like the British blockade. That's stopping American right to trade. But they considered the submarines because that could damage American ships more of an act of hostility. Mustard gas, called Ypirite, was first used by the Germans in September of 1917. It was the most lethal of all the poison chemicals used during that war. It was almost odorless and took 12 hours to take effect. Ypirite was so powerful that only a small amount had to be added to high explosive shells to be effective. Once in the soil, gas remained active for several weeks. So first of all, it's highly deadly. It has no odor. You can't see it. And it lasts in the soil for weeks. Now, think about this. Not that this is good, but I would assume that if you're a soldier and the bombardment is coming, there's a certain sense of like bracing yourself, like, okay, we're under attack, but this will end. Ah, the attack is over. I survived. But you couldn't do this with the advent of gas, because who knows what you touched, breathed in, or walked by, something that happened a week earlier. It's all possible. This is what mustard gas did. The skin of the victims of mustard gas blistered, and the eyes became very sore, and they began to vomit. Mustard gas caused great internal and external bleeding and attacked the bronchial tubes, stripping the mucous membrane. This was extremely painful, and most soldiers had to be strapped to their beds. It usually took a person 4 or 5 weeks to die of mustard gas poisoning. One nurse wrote, "I wish those who talk about this war going on, whatever the cost, could see the soldiers suffering from mustard gas poisoning. Great mustard-colored blisters, blind eyes all sticky and stuck together, always fighting for breath with voices a mere whisper, knowing that their throats will close up and they know that they will choke." Savage stuff. Illegal today under international law. Certainly have been cases where people, countries, leaders, dictators, awful people have continued to use them. Moving in then to these last couple of years, stop for a minute and just come up with an adjective to describe that scene. I mean, for me, that is the World War I photograph. The lone soldier, the darkness, the gloom. He's bent over, the heaviness. Uh, whose cross is he looking at? Whose graves? Childhood friend? Random person? We don't know. But some of the images that you see from this still are just find so striking and haunting. Recall, the United States was very clear at the beginning. We are not getting involved. We are neutral in thought as well as deed. In other words, we're not only not going to start supporting one side or the other, we are actually going to not even take sides or show a preference. There was a call. Hmm. Well, that was kind of frustrating. I put pause so I could cough and just kind of cut me off. Um, Almost all Americans, public opinion polls, which are just starting, virtually everybody agreed that the United States should not get involved in this war. And you can probably think, the reasons why. I mean, first of all, it doesn't look like a lot of fun. The blood wasn't just fine. We've already seen 7, 8, 9 million young men murdered in the mud, dying these horrifying deaths. And the United States has nothing to gain from it. The United States has nothing to fear. No one's going to be invading the United States. Also, the United States has a long history of just not getting involved in European affairs like this. You remember the Monroe Doctrine didn't just say Europeans stay out of the Americas. You get into your wars, that's your business. But also, so many Americans were hyphenated Americans. Are you Russian American? Are you British American? Are you French American? And there were many, many, many millions of German Americans. My grandfather, who was 16 when the war broke out, and he was already in the United States by then. Now, my grandfather, who I knew barely growing up, couldn't stand the Kaiser. You already know that story, and would not have been a supporter of German militarism and would not have been pro Germany per se. Would he want his new country, though, to be actively going and killing off many of his relatives, of his family, of his. So it seemed to make sense for the United States to stay out. Also, there was a huge Irish American population. Now, what would the Irish care? Ireland had been invaded by Britain in the 1200s, and the Irish were absolutely fighting for independence at this point. Um, Anything that would help Great Britain is not something that an Irish American would want. So it was pretty much consensus, not our war, we're staying out. What brought the United States into it? Okay, the United States was neutral in thought as well as deed. But how neutral were they? Economic ties. In 1914, the numbers I have is that about $753 million was sent in weapons and clothes and medicines and food to the Allies. And you'll notice by 1916, that had quadrupled, gone from 750 million to 3 billion. Why? Out of an act of support? Not really. These are businesses. These are farmers. These are arms manufacturers. These are boot manufacturers. There's money to be made. There is a market for American made goods. And yeah, allied countries, France and Britain want to buy them? Great. Now, would they be willing to trade with the Central Powers? Sure. Absolutely. Now you'll notice it's lesser, but if you look at that ratio from 1914, you see 753 million to 345 million. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio, a little bit more. So the United States was, clearly willing to trade with either country. But look at what happens. While the amount triples going to the Allies in the next 2 years, it declines by 90%, even more, to the Central Powers. Why? Because the United States people, United States government became strongly pro-ally? No, not at all. The blockades. The blockades stopped this from happening. And as I mentioned, the American government was outraged. Look, Great Britain, you can't do this. It's our right, freedom of the seas. Do not do this blockade. It is wrong. But when American trade ships were being intercepted trying to get to Germany, people weren't dying. The German submarines hitting American ships, they were. There was really never a chance. I say cultural connections, but the United States is in many ways an offshoot of England. The language, the customs, government, etc. It is possible the United States could have managed to stay out of the entire war for sure. It was never going to join on the side of the Germans. The United States began to build up its military in 1916. It had one of the smallest in the world, certainly the smallest among the big powers. Um, there was a growing movement. Well, what if we need to get involved in this war? Well, if we need to get involved in this war, then we ought to be ready for it. Others argued, wait a minute, we start building up our military just in case. That makes it more likely we'll actually get involved. But there's debate about it, and the United States was certainly more ready to go to war by 1917. The key thing was in February of 1917, Germans announced an unrestricted sub-warfare policy. The United States, anybody, any ship, any country, anything civilian, military, it does not matter. If it's on the Atlantic Ocean, the German submarines have a right to destroy it. Now, don't the Germans realize that this will drag the United States into this war? They'll join the British. They certainly do. But keep in mind where the Germans were at this point. They had been completely shut down by this blockade. They were hungry. They were running out of weapons. They were running out of time, and they knew if they didn't bring this war to an end fairly quickly, Germany was going to starve and bleed to death. So the Germans made a fairly desperate gamble. They knew that the United States was not ready to start fighting. They didn't have the military to do this. They thought it would probably take about a year, maybe a little bit less, for the Americans to get involved. And in fact, the Americans don't get actually directly involved until February of 1918. But here's what the Germans were hoping for. Because Americans will start holding on to their own food, supplies, weapons, it would cut them off from the French and the British. The Germans could launch some attacks. The French and the British wouldn't be as prepared for this. The Germans could win back some land, get in a better position, and just as the Americans are ready to come in, ask for a truce. It does not happen, though. It does not happen. The stalemate remains. When Americans come in, Germany is basically pretty desperate and has almost no chance of winning. And then the Zimmermann telegram. Zimmermann was the German ambassador to Mexico. It was a secret telegram that was discovered by, I don't remember who found it, but the United States government got word. The Germans had written to Mexico and said, come, be a central power, join the war. And if you do, when we're successful, we will help you to get back land that the United States took from you 70 years earlier. Remember that California, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, those are pretty darn Spanish sounding terms. They were part of Mexico until 1848. Now, the Mexican government never seriously considered this. Realistically, was Germany going to take back parts of the United States to give back to Mexico? Probably not. But at least in public opinion, the United States was like, wait a minute, if the Germans are actively interfering with our neighbor to try to damage us, they are the enemy. And war was declared in April of 1917. Again, it would be 10 months before Americans start fighting, but it makes a pretty big difference. Woodrow Wilson said, why are we doing it? To make the world safe for democracy. You might ask, who does not feel that the United States is a great democracy? And you're going to be well familiar with the names of one of the people who had major doubts about that. Okay, famous propaganda poster. And again, it's powerful. His eyes looking right at you, finger pointing at you. You can move your camera around or you move your laptop around, and the eyes and finger always pointing at you. Once recruits? No, once you. This is advertising. This is pretty gross, but it is an attempt to use that image as an anti-war statement. It is a photograph from World War I. It was actually put out by an anarchist punk band called Crass in the 1970s. But of course, you get a different idea. Your country needs you, with the hand there like you saw in the last one, to do what? Well, to die a horrifying, miserable, pointless death. Do not be a part of the war effort. Remember that your propaganda projects absolutely can be anti-war. There were people, they didn't get along very well in their countries, and they faced a lot of danger doing so, but they said, we cannot support this war effort. We think it's inhumane for everybody. Yeah, I'd mentioned somebody who probably didn't buy this make the world safe for democracy, and that is W.E.B. Du Bois. Of course, we've already read his African Roots of War. The question was, now that war's been called, what should Black Americans do? Should they do all they can as loyal Americans to support the American war effort? Or if they're living in a country in which they have basically don't have the right to vote. They are living in poverty. There is no judicial system that benefits them. They can be attacked and are attacked by white mobs without any difficulties whatsoever. What should they do? A Du Bois story, if I were in class, we'd probably talk about separately, but it's pretty powerful. There was an interview with Du Bois when he was 95 years old. I think you might know that he gave up on the United States and he moved to Ghana and just said, this country will never be a just place to people of color. It just never will be. I give up on this country. So just before his death, a few months before, a magazine called The Atlantic did an interview with him, and they described his body. It was broken down. He was 95. He had trouble moving, but the guy said, his voice was so it was there. His mind was there. He was angry, he was powerful, and he had not forgotten. One of the questions that he had asked, the interviewer said, Mr. Du Bois, do you remember when you were in Atlanta? You moved there in 1920, right? And he said, yes, sir, I did. Did you ever make contact of Joel Chandler Harris? Joel Chandler Harris was a fairly well-known white writer who apparently was a pretty good white Southerner in terms of race relations. Like he actually stood up for black people. And Du Bois said, when I went down to Atlanta for the first time, I had a letter of invitation to go meet him. I was on my way to meet him. I walked, and I walked past a grocery store, and hanging in the window were the fingers of a Negro that they had lynched yesterday. I tore up the letter, and I went right back home. And the interviewer said, well, but that's not Joel Chandler Harris's fault. People say he was a good man. I mean, say, no. And he cut him off, and you can hear his voice. No, no. He was able to live with that situation, with those conditions. He was able to accept it in some way. I wanted no part of him. Well, here's the question. What happens in this case? Do you say white and black Americans join the military, support the USA, or do you say we have no democracy here? We are not dying for, your version of this. Du Bois was pretty smart about this. He said, look, I'm going to call this a damnable dilemma. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Now, you might say at some level, you just say, well, of course not. A man like Du Bois could never, ever encourage black Americans to risk their lives for some kind of a ridiculous version of democracy that he would never even enjoy. Problem with this, they'd be considered disloyal, cowardly. There could be a major backlash of violence against a population that refused to support its country at war. So, what should they do? Du Bois, and this really is something most people he wouldn't really talk about for the rest of his life. He lived another 50 years. But he really never quite addressed it, but there was a sense that he regretted it. He ultimately said, I encourage all black men to fight, to be a part of this war effort, to do everything they can to defeat Germany. And partly because he saw Germany. He actually spoke German, lived in Germany for a while. He saw German militarism as a real threat. But above all, he believed that if Black America stood up behind this war, showed their courage, their patriotism, their heroism, that white America would have to accept this, would have to appreciate this and give more value. Um, it didn't happen. After the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan, many of you know, the white supremacist group, mushroomed into, I think it's close to 4 million dues-paying members. Lynchings went out of control. Civil rights situation in the 1920s is one of the worst periods ever. There are many cases of black soldiers in uniform who are grabbed off the street and lynched because white Americans didn't like their attitudes. Again, tough decision. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. There were about 400,000 soldiers, many following Du Bois' advice. They were segregated, of course, only under white officers. mistreated badly, could not be trusted to handle a gun. There's very few exceptions. A couple regiments did have black soldiers in combat, but they were there to dig latrines and cook, etc., to provide manual labor because these people can't be trusted with actual guns. There were, however, some black officers, again, not high level, and there was always somebody directly over them. I think in some ways the key, though, although Black Americans do play a role in U.S. and Allied success in it, it's also this. A lot of these soldiers, they go off to Europe, most from the American South, because that's where most Black Americans lived, having been mistreated and abused and living in fear. And, there are all kinds of stories. People wrote letters home. This young Black corporal walks into a French cafe after the war and says, "Excuse me, sir, where do colored sit?" And the French owner of the cafe, who has no reason to dislike black people at all, sees the black man in uniform and kisses him on both cheeks and says, "Oh, monsieur, thank you, you're France's savior, and the wine and dinner is on the house." And you know what? These people got treated like respected human beings, and call them crazy. They liked it, and they came back expecting things to change. There is something in the 1920s in the United States called the New Negro. In other words, we ain't putting up with this anymore. The new Negro the new Negro has no fear. And pretty powerful sentiment. Wars, I don't actually like studying a whole lot about the who shot who and the weapons and the death per se, but wars are major, major changes of society too. And we see this with both World War I and World War II in terms of racial justice in the United States. So, what's the U.S. impact on the war? Well, first of all, it's interesting. If you were to say the United States was one of the allies, you are not correct about that. The United States became an associate of the Allies, and that's very distinct because at this point that the British and the French, who are just dying in these trenches and running out of men, oh, there are 4 or 5 million American soldiers coming over. Great, throw them in the trenches. We'll overwhelm the Germans and we'll win. Americans, for a couple reasons. First of all, a lot of skepticism. We're not willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands or more of our young men for this ridiculous war that we didn't want to be in. Also knew that although support for the war in the United States grew dramatically once the United States agreed to enter, I'll tell you that if in the first couple months of fighting, 100, 200,000 Americans, got letters that their sons had been killed, that support would have disappeared very quickly. So they were kept American soldiers. They stayed under their own command. They did not take orders from the French or the British. And they didn't go into the trenches for the most part. For the most part. Now, you don't get the idea here that, oh, so they were just there in advisory role. No, 110,000 were killed. That's a lot of people. But again, it was not the same type of combat on the big scale. Look, 2 million troops. It was 5 million total, including back in the United States. But this is the difference. Two armies have been fighting for 3 years and getting worn down, and one side gets suddenly 2 million soldiers heavily armed at the end, makes all the difference in the world. At this point, Germany is so weakened by the blockade, running out of food, running out of weapons, running out of medicines, and the Allies have 2 million new soldiers on their end. It's a matter of time. The supplies continue. The tax money in the United States, the war bonds, billions of dollars of supplies, everything. Everything. This was a war that was essentially over at this point. And in fact, it was November 11th. In fact, today's November 11th, as I'm recording this, 1918, that the Germans surrender. Very important. They surrender unconditionally. And that's going to be a very, very important point for understanding World War II. It's a total surrender. It is not negotiated. Okay, very important. What is that a photo of? Well, that is a man surrounded by his many fans. Sounds like a pun. It is a pun. Who is that man? That was my daddy. My dad, Robert H. Seeger, wrote a book, America's Great War, World War I, and the American Experience. And he always liked this photograph, and he always made a point of saying, Well, I was surrounded by many fans. Yes, yes. You can tell where I got my sense of humor from, for sure, for sure. So the war is over. November 11th, 11:11 at what time do you think? 11 a.m. The final armistice was called. There would be no more firing. The Central Powers surrender, and it is an unconditional surrender. So there's no negotiation. It is up to the Allies to decide what the peace will look like. And as you'll see in the next section, it wasn't done in a very effective way. There's celebration, probably in New York City, soldiers coming home, etc. So, looking back at the end of this war, 4 years long, probably 9 million soldiers dead, probably 15 million total dead, including civilians and people that are starved and everything, is absolutely brutal. I say only 110,000 soldiers, but I feel always sort of callous about doing that because one person is a tragedy and 110,000, there's no only about that. But comparatively, and this is important, remember, the United States joined the war toward the end. They did not formally become an ally. They did not suffer in anywhere near, both in terms of deaths, but in terms of destruction of land, as France and the UK did. Do you think France and the UK is going to be willing to take the United States' advice about a peace treaty? And the answer, they are not. And that's one of the reasons, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Seriously injured people, some that never recover in their lives. They are shells of human beings, 37 million. The costs, a third of $1 trillion. I don't even know what that would be in today's money, but horrifying. Um, you know, this was a terrible time to be a geography student because you used to be able to say, oh, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, yep, this new German Empire, all gone within 4 years. They don't exist anymore. Germany was left absolutely weak, powerless, emasculated, infuriated, victimized. You're going to see what that leads to. The United States, it's the American century. The United States is the one power that emerges from this so much stronger. What do you think the economies are like? Germany's a wreck. We got it. But do you think the British economy is doing well with its million dead? Do you think that the French, they've seen so much of its countryside destroyed and lost, I don't know, 1.4 million people? No, they are economic wrecks. The United States was getting rich funding this war over that time. And you know what? Now, the United States, by the way, economically dominant, no question. Does the United States want to become militarily dominant? And that's a different question that the United States has to decide. And finally, the indirect result of World War II, there's a line of thinking that just says, you know what? It wasn't two world wars. It was one world war with a 20-year break. That's not accurate for a number of reasons, but there's something to it. The peace that came out of World War I was a major part of World War II and why that happened. Okay, we've gotten to the end of this. I got to admit, I did this fairly well. Again, you're going to have some time to work on this, work on some of it in class today. Um, and then I'll set a due date for it and expect people to do good work on this, and then we'll move on next week. Hope to see you guys soon. Miss you. Bye.